Hello everyone, and welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name's Charles Godfrey. I'm the director here. For those of you who don't know the Oxford Martin School, we're a grouping within the university that does interdisciplinary research targeted at what we think are the critical problems of the 21st century. We're here due to the generosity of Jim Martin and the Martin family, and Jim's portrait is in the hall downstairs. So it gives me huge pleasure this afternoon to welcome Sir Andrew Haines, who's going to be talking this afternoon. Andy has done so many things that if I was to read out everything, there'd be little time for his talk. So I'm just going to mention a few things. Andy is a past director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and has been hugely influential in promulgating the new agenda of planetary health. And the title of Andy's talk this afternoon is Planetary Health, is Human Health at Risk in the Anthropocene? Planetary health has been the subject of a big program run by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Lancet Commission that Andy chaired. And Andy is also a member of the Rockefeller Foundation Economic Council on Planetary Health, which is a new project that is based at the Oxford Martin School. So we're hugely grateful for his involvement in that. So with no more ado, Andy, can I ask you to give your lecture?
Well, thank you so much, Charles, and it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here this evening and to say something about the challenge of trying to safeguard the health of humanity in what is going to be an unprecedented era. As you know, we're now in the Anthropocene epoch, which poses very different challenges to health, to human health, I think, than the preceding Holocene. And I'll do my best to summarize some of these during my talk, but also to focus on some potential solutions. Maybe solutions is too grandiose a word, but at least policy options that could help us to address some of these challenges. So this concept of planetary health was, actually it wasn't my idea, it was actually Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet, that said he thought we needed a new word, a new term to define some of these emerging challenges that are confronting humanity in the dawn of this new epoch. So planetary health really is designed to emphasize the interrelationship between human health and the state of the natural environment. And I think it's fair to say that we in global health or public health, whatever you want to call our domain, have largely neglected the foundation of human health being based on natural systems. So we've tended to assume that global health is going to continue on improving. There's been very dramatic improvements in human health over the last century or so. Recent decades, for example, we've seen life expectancy increase by 20 years. We've seen dramatic declines in infant mortality and maternal mortality and so on. And so when you read some of the reports like health converging by 2035, well, maybe that's true, maybe health will converge by 2035, but maybe it will diverge again after that if we're not careful about addressing some of the burgeoning challenges that we're seeing. So the Anthropocene epoch, I think, is now pretty broadly accepted in the scientific community. As you know, the Holocene was that period of 11,700 years or so, during which humanity emerged from hunter-gatherers into agriculture, into the urban civilization that we're increasingly living in today. And it's been called the Great Acceleration. People debate exactly when it's taken place, probably in the middle of the last century. Some people think at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. But what you can see on the left side is these dramatic socioeconomic trends. So we've seen obviously a dramatic increase in world population, now around 7 billion, perhaps 10 billion, perhaps more by the end of the century. Recent projections suggest more. GDP has dramatically increased. Investment has increased. It's been paralleled by increases in the use in energy, for example, largely, of course, through fossil fuels, fertilizer consumption, water use, and a whole range of other markers, really, of our kind of consumer economy. So we've been using energy, water, other resources to drive the economic growth that's really resulted in this human progress. It's been a remarkable transformation. But that's come at a price, of course, and the price has been borne largely by these Earth systems that are shown on the right side of this graph. You can see increases in carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas. CO2, of course, is a long-acting greenhouse gas, so about 20% of it stays up in the atmosphere for more than 1,000 years. So as far as we understand at the moment, it's a legacy that we're leaving to future generations. We're seeing acidification of the oceans, so as CO2 increases in the atmosphere, of course it dissolves in the oceans, and that's resulting in change in pH, with all sorts of implications for marine ecosystems, particularly, for example, for shellfish, which we're finding it increasingly difficult to lay down their shells. We're seeing nitrogen loading causing eutrophication of many water sources, dramatic declines in tropical forests, and so on. So this combination of human advances and negative Earth system trends has led to the renaming of the new epoch as the Anthropocene, of course, because it's dominated by one species, our own species. And of course, it's led to the term planetary boundaries, being coined by Will Steffen and Johan Rockstrom. And I think you have another lecture coming up, I saw in a few weeks' time, on planetary boundaries, so I won't attempt to describe them. But just to say that I think there are some of them are clearer than others. So I think there's general consensus that we do have a boundary around about 2 degrees of global warming from pre-industrial times, above which the risk of catastrophic events increases fairly substantially. Others are much more difficult to define. For example, novel entities like multiple chemical entities and our exposure to them. I think it's unlikely there's a single boundary. I think there's a lot of emerging science in that particular area. So, yes, it's a useful concept. It emphasizes the fact that we live on a small planet. There must be finite boundaries, and those are easier to characterize in some domains than others. So what sort of impacts might these global environmental changes have on health? So there are 3 broad categories, I think. The direct effects, so in climate change terms, heat and other extreme events, for example. Ecosystem-mediated effects through emerging infectious diseases, vector-borne diseases, waterborne diseases, food supply and undernutrition. And then those effects which are mediated socially through, for example, increases in poverty, environmental change pushing more poor and deprived and vulnerable populations back into poverty from which they may have only recently emerged, or preventing them from emerging from poverty. Perhaps migration, and rather controversially, conflict as well, which I'll come on to in just a moment. In our work at the Planetary Health Commission, we tried to look to see what evidence there was for these impacts of these multiple environmental changes on human health. We did an overview of systematic reviews. We looked at about 150 systematic reviews, and we found about 25 of them good quality systematic reviews using standard criteria. So it was immediately apparent that there were big gaps in the evidence about the magnitude and the impact of these environmental changes on human health. And this is obviously an urgent demand or an urgent need for us to really try to fill in some of these evidence gaps. There is emerging evidence around some of these environmental changes singly, but very little evidence about how they will play out when you look at them holistically, and the ways in which they might interact. So let me give you a few snapshots of what we know about some of these impacts. Climate change, of course, is the one that we know most about, and this just shows you 2 different futures, essentially. We already know that climate's increased by about 1 degree since pre-industrial times. We're likely to exceed 1.5. It's going to be almost impossible to keep below that unless we can actually start to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere, which we can't do at present time in a fast enough rate. And the danger is, of course, we'll go on that upper line, which is the red line, possibly up to 4 degrees or maybe even more under some scenarios by the end of the century, which of course would have dramatic adverse effects for humanity. So these 2 futures, essentially they'll depend on the choices that we make over the next few decades. At the moment, we're somewhere in between them. If the Paris Declaration, the commitments in Paris are all implemented, then we're heading for about 3 degrees warming above pre-industrial, something of that order, which will in itself pose major challenges for humanity. There are, of course, links between climate and other environmental changes and some of the fairly familiar environmental exposures that we have at the moment. A lot is known about air pollution. Some of you have seen that there was another Lancet Commission that came out just last year, the Lancet Commission on Pollution, which filled in some of the gaps in evidence around the health effects of pollution, showed that pollution is responsible for over 9 million deaths a year. Many of those, of course, due to air pollution. And a lot of air pollution is related to the fine particulate air pollution, and to some extent ozone as well, comes from our relationships with energy, the way in which we use energy, much of it, of course, due to fossil fuel burning, but also solid fuels in low-income countries like biomass, dung, and other fuels that are used to provide domestic energy in low-income countries. So what do we know about the effects of climate change? Well, the Lancet Countdown, which is trying to track progress on health and climate change, published last year in the Lancet, gave its kind of first report of the state of science, and there are obviously a lot of gaps. But some of the estimates that they've done suggested that between 2000 and 2016, the number of vulnerable people, elderly people, exposed to heatwave events has already increased by about 125 million. A lot of fluctuation from year to year due to natural variability. But the modeled estimates that we have do suggest increasing exposure to extreme temperatures. We also believe that there's a decline in labour capacity as the temperature warms, of course. In many tropical and subtropical countries, it becomes progressively more difficult to work. If you're an outdoor labourer under intense heat, of course, then your labour productivity goes down. So again, the increase in temperature that we've already seen over recent decades has probably resulted in a reduction in global physical labour capacity of around 5%. And the slide on the right shows you roughly where that's likely to be happening at the moment. And there's a lot more work needed in how we can safeguard the future of people working outdoors in these increasingly extreme exposures. We also know that in some cities, for example, in a sense magnify some of the heat effect because they have the urban heat islands, so cities are warmer than the surrounding rural regions for a variety of reasons. They reflect and absorb heat and often reflect that heat, and the heat emerges again during the nighttime, so you get increases in nighttime temperatures. And this slide just shows you, based on some work we've been doing at the London School, where heat-related deaths are likely to go up by the latter part of the century unless we can really mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. This is a recent paper in Lancet Planetary Health. The depth of the colour of red shows you where the mortality is likely to increase most. And you can see in Southeast Asia, for example, Southern Europe, perhaps parts of Southeastern USA. There's a big gap in Africa, not because heat exposure is not important in Africa, but because we don't actually have data from African cities. And so we actually need to fill that gap in order to project forward these estimates for the future. We know also that in addition to these direct effects, there are many, many indirect effects that I kind of alluded to earlier on. One of the most important, of course, is on food insecurity, crop yield, and hunger and undernutrition. And Marco and Charles' colleagues have been doing a lot of work on this. The best estimate we have is probably 500,000 extra deaths by the middle of the century. Obviously, lots of uncertainties depending on mitigation strategies and adaptation. But that gives you a rough order of magnitude of the impacts. And you can see that there's an overlap between the likely effects on crop yield, where they're distributed. The red shows you where there are going to be big negative effects, almost certainly, and the global hunger index. So you can see that the hunger is obviously greatest in sub-Saharan Africa, to some extent in Southern Asia. So it does suggest that climate change will magnify the effects of undernutrition in these environments, unless we can put in place effective adaptation strategy. And in fact, we're seeing already that after years of progress, hunger is on the rise. You can see the number of people undernourished, most recent figures, 2016, showing you that there is this upward swing. Now, we don't know if that's going to be persistent, of course, too early to say. We can't be absolutely certain this is due to climate change, but it's compatible with the kind of things that we would expect to see with climate change. So the jury's still out about attribution, but we need to do more work in the area. So there are big threats then likely to global food security and to the vulnerability of populations, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and other vulnerable regions. But it isn't just, of course, the quantity of food, it's also the quality of food. And as you increase CO2 in the atmosphere, you stimulate plant growth to some extent in C3 crops, but you also affect nutrient quality. So this slide just shows you a meta-analysis of over 7,000 observations a few years ago. And what you can see is that some of these trace elements like iron and zinc, for example, decline as you increase the CO2 levels. So yes, you may increase the yield of some crops, but those crops may be nutritionally less effective than current crops. And we know already that 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies, so that problem may amplify as CO2 levels increase. Some work we've been doing recently on fruit and vegetables is summarized in this slide. Again, it's a big systematic review that we've just submitting at the moment. Fruit and vegetables are very important for public health because they are protective for non-communicable diseases. So if you don't eat enough fruit and vegetables, it increases your risk of heart disease, stroke, and some types of cancer. And we know that many countries around the world, people don't eat enough fruit and vegetables, and therefore they're at an increased risk of these diseases. So environmental change will have largely negative effects on fruit and vegetables. There may be a fertilization effect of CO2, but as I've already said, that may be offset by a lack of reduction in nutrient quality. But these other factors like water availability, temperature, ozone, which may also get worse with environmental change, are all negative. So this means we can see almost certainly increased challenges to fruit and vegetable production, particularly in tropical, subtropical, and other vulnerable regions with environmental change. And we know that some locations are particularly vulnerable. We've been doing some work recently in India, which is a very interesting challenge. India is facing 4 interlinked challenges: population growth, dietary change, increasing westernization of diet, increasing demand for animal products, most likely, and more processed foods. Groundwater depletion, which is greater in some areas than others. You can see it on the map here, the red areas where there's extremely high water stress. And of course, climate change. So it has these 4 interlinked pressures on its food systems. And we know from some of the work we've been doing recently that there's differences in the environmental footprint of the food system in India and Europe. So in Europe, the CO2 emissions, the GHG emissions more broadly, tend to be higher from the food system. The water footprint, the green water footprint is higher, but the blue water footprint is higher in India. The blue water footprint is that part of the water footprint that depends on groundwater resources, so irrigation. So what that means is that India is more dependent on irrigation water, and they're depleting that non-renewable resource at unsustainable rates. So there are somewhat different challenges in different parts of the world, different ways in which the food system has an impact on the environment. But countries like India and some others are facing multiple challenges which will need to be addressed. Drought is, of course, projected to increase with climate change. Top slide just shows you a 4-degree world, what that might look like. And already in 2015, 14% of the land area was in severe to extreme drought. And we can't be sure that that was necessarily all due to climate change, but these are the kind of fluctuations that you would expect to see. And as I've mentioned, it's not just climate change, it's also the fact we're depleting aquifers at an unsustainable rate. So if you look at the Arab world, for example, the per capita freshwater availability has declined by about 3/4 in the last 50 years or so. So they are depleting their aquifers at this unsustainable rate, and they'll have the combined challenges of climate change and aquifer depletion. There are many links between biodiversity and agriculture. Agriculture and land use change is one of the major drivers of loss of biodiversity, lost species loss, which is occurring at about 100-fold greater than the pre-human times. And at the same time, we're also increasingly using a very small proportion of the agricultural biodiversity to feed human populations. So of the globally identified plant species, about 250,000, about 7,000 have been used for food by humans throughout history. And we're now currently dependent on around about 12 crops for the majority of our energy intake. So that means we're reducing, to some extent, the diversity of diet. That may have implications for human health. So, for example, you can satisfy dietary energy with a less diverse diet, but you may not be able to satisfy micronutrient supply quite so easily. So that has implications for human health and of course also for the broader environment. We can't look to oceans necessarily to replace what we're losing on the land. So as we overexploit our terrestrial resources for food, we can't necessarily look to the oceans to make good that shortfall, and that's because we're also overexploiting the oceans as well. About 90% of the world's fisheries are fully or excessively exploited. And this slide shows you how actual fisheries yields are actually declining. And a lot of that, of course, is due to industrial fishing. And some of that is threatening, again, vulnerable populations, many of which depend on seafood, fish and other seafood for their nutrient intake. So about over 2 billion people depend on the sea for a substantial proportion of their protein and other essential nutrient intake. And these people are going to be particularly vulnerable. And of course, the sea is under multiple other stresses as well, with ocean acidification I mentioned, and also climate change, which is changing the distribution of fish species. So we can't look to the sea necessarily, certainly in the way we're exploiting it at present, to make up this shortfall. So in conclusion, what we can say is that by 2050, there's going to be about 2 billion more people, about 3 billion more in the middle class, with accelerating demands for animal products, which we know are particularly damaging for the environment. Fisheries are in decline. Climate change is going to stress agricultural systems, particularly in subtropical and tropical climates, and CO2 is reducing nutrient concentrations. So we have these multiple stressors which really need to be addressed as a matter of urgency and policy. We know that rising seas could increasingly affect coastal populations, perhaps over 1 billion people by mid-century or so. Many of the growing populations around coastal deltas, for example, are very susceptible to sea level rise. You can adapt to some degree, but that requires major investments. We believe that some health effects of sea level rise and may already be occurring. Some work that my colleague Pauline Shielbeek's been doing in Bangladesh with Bangladeshi colleagues shows that there's an unusually high incidence of preeclampsia and hypertension in pregnancy in coastal pregnant women. And the work that she's been leading has shown that there's a significant association with drinking water sodium. And what we believe is happening is that as the sea level rises gradually, as they dam rivers to create shrimp farming, to irrigate land, the combination of these factors is causing salination of these coastal aquifers, which people are dependent on. So in the dry season, the salt level goes up, may go down again in the wet season, and this puts quite a lot of strain on these physiological systems. Pregnant women seem to be particularly susceptible, but it also increases blood pressure in non-pregnant adults. So addressing these kind of challenges through better ways of providing fresh water to these coastal populations is going to be crucial. And then land use change, which is, of course, I've said, a major driver of biodiversity loss, is also causing some direct and indirect health effects. And this is just an example from Southeast Asia, from the massive fires in Sumatra, Kalimantan, in 2015. So this was an El Nino event. It wasn't necessarily climate change, but climate change may magnify the effects of these El Nino events. And you see extraordinary levels of air pollution. If you were in Singapore or Malaysia around that time, you would have actually experienced at first hand the very high levels of fine particulate air pollution. Probably 100,000 excess deaths across these three countries. And also massive effects of massive releases of greenhouse gases. As you burn the peat, you release, as well as the air pollution, you release lots of CO2 and other greenhouse pollutants. So at one point, these daily emissions from the Indonesian fires were exceeding the whole of the US economy for a period. We also know that infectious disease distribution is changing as a result of environmental change. These are the drivers of infectious diseases vector-borne diseases in Europe. Some work by Jan Semenza and colleagues published a year or so back in Emerging Infectious Diseases. And they suggested that natural environment, climate, were major drivers of changes in some of these vector-borne diseases that are being seen in Europe. So again, there are interaction between multiple factors. It's often not a simple relationship, but climate and other environmental changes may, and almost certainly are, playing a role in the changing distribution of some of these vector-borne diseases. And we also know that some of the emerging zoonotic diseases are linked to land use change as humans and animals come into greater contact because of land use change. This may trigger the transmission of zoonotic diseases. And as you can see here, land use change, food industry changes, agriculture, and perhaps a bit of climate and weather are all having effects on these emerging diseases. Just one example, colleagues at the London School have been looking at the emergence of Plasmodium knowlesii in Southeast Asia, which is a form of malaria that's carried by marmosets. And they seem to have documented an increase in transmission related to the changing relationship between the marmoset population and human populations, triggered by land use change, palm oil plantations, and so on. And then finally, and quite controversially, conflict. Is conflict related to environmental change? There's been an immense debate, of course, in the literature about this, with some strongly held views on different sides. I think it's very clear that it's not a simple relationship. It probably is having an effect in some situations. This is just one case study, which doesn't prove a causal relationship by itself, but it's consistent with the causal relationship. This is a case study of Syria, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a couple of years ago, which suggested that the Syrian tragedy was preceded by an unprecedented drought, which drove up food prices and drove people from rural to urban areas and precipitated, of course, a crackdown by an autocratic dictator, which, in a sense, fanned the flames of this conflagration. So that's enough about the problems. I want to just, in the last part of my talk, try to move on to some potential policy options to address some of these interrelated challenges. And I'll go fairly quickly through them, but hopefully we can pick them up in the discussion period. So we identified 3 types of challenges that needed to be addressed in our Planetary Health Commission report. We called them imagination or conceptual challenges. For example, the fact that we tend to conceptualize human progress in terms of economic growth, in terms of the increase of GDP. But the increase in GDP is not necessarily a good metric of human progress, and it doesn't necessarily take into account the natural systems or the way in which we're impairing the functioning of natural systems. Then the second category was knowledge challenges. There's a lot that we don't know. We've invested billions and billions in biomedicine, all to the good, and my own institution has benefited from some of those funds, but we've invested very little, really, in understanding these complex interrelations between environmental change and human health. So we need to change the patterns of knowledge investment. And that's beginning to happen, thanks to the Wellcome Trust and others. But it's starting from a very low base. And then finally, implementation challenges. Even when we know what to do, we often don't do it. So we know that we need to move towards a low-carbon economy, but we're not moving quickly enough, and so on. And there are major vested interests that are preventing us moving forward, and many other factors. So we need to overcome barriers to change through economy-wide strategies. The UN has suggested we need to tackle these 4 issues. We need to decouple and change lifestyles. We need to decouple lifestyles from environmental impacts, detoxify the environment, reduce pollution, enhance ecosystem resilience, and decarbonize the economy. Move towards a more circular economy by integrating policies and strengthening governance across a range of different sectors. The SDG era offers us the potential to integrate some of these policies. SDG 3 is about health and well-being, but it's fairly narrowly conceptualized. It's mainly about universal health coverage. But actually, of course, health permeates through the SDGs. It's part of number 1, which is poverty alleviation, number 2, which is around addressing food insecurity and nutrition, around 5, which is around gender equity, 4, which is education, 7, which is energy, 6, water and sanitation. I could go through them all. They're all linked to human health in one way or another. So we need to see the SDGs as an opportunity to address human health and well-being through an intersectoral lens. There are policies we can implement now which will improve health. One of them, of course, is moving towards clean energy. The recent report of the International Energy Agency has shown us how a modest percentage increase in investment can save over 3 million lives in 2040, while providing energy access for all and making us more energy secure, as well as leading to a peak in CO2 within the next decade or so. So it is possible. It will require a bit of extra investment, but when you factor in the benefits to human health, if you value those using standard economic instruments, they can help to offset many of the additional costs, which in percentage terms are actually very small. It isn't just CO2, it's also measures to reduce black carbon, which is an important short-lived climate pollutant and air pollutant, and methane, which of course is emitted from ruminants, from gas leaks and other sources. And the best prospect of keeping under 2 degrees is to tackle both CO2 and these short-lived climate pollutants in concert. And if you do that, as illustrated on this slide, then you can see the bottom line shows us that if we tackle all these climate-active pollutants simultaneously, then there's still a chance to keep below 2 degrees. And by the way, in doing so, we can probably prevent about 2 million, something of that order, annual premature deaths from outdoor air pollution and increase crop yields at the same time. So a lot of multiple benefits really from these climate change mitigation strategies and real prospects for keeping below 2 degrees. But in order to foster that, we need to change the economic incentives. There are massive, of course, subsidies within the energy system at the moment. There are the direct subsidies, which probably amount to just under 400 billion. But if you take into account the indirect subsidies, in other words, the costs, the full economic costs, which are not factored into energy policy, then they're much higher than that, perhaps around 5 trillion, something of that order, if you take into account the effects of air pollution. And only about 13% of current greenhouse gas emissions are covered by carbon pricing, and much of that is inadequate. So that's an urgent priority, to price carbon adequately, and that will drive down emissions very quickly. Urban policies are absolutely crucial because cities are responsible for the lion's share of economic activity and, of course, for most of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. And this slide shows you 2 cities. The story of Atlanta on the left, Barcelona on the right. So Atlanta is population about 5 million. Barcelona, similar population. Atlanta is spread out over 7,500 square kilometers. Barcelona is much more compact, it's about 600 square kilometers. And what you can see is that they can host the same population, but the transport-related carbon emissions are tremendously different. They're about 15% of those in Barcelona, of those in Atlanta. And the reason for that is because it's very difficult to avoid using your private car in Atlanta. You have to drive everywhere. It's very difficult to walk and cycle. Now, the Atlanta authorities are trying to do something about that, but it's because they have their work cut out trying to kind of retrofit the city for the coming century. So the way in which we design cities is going to be crucial for the future. Most of the cities we live in, the challenge is retrofitting them. But in Africa, many cities that are going to be large by the end of the century are still growing. Some of them are still tiny towns. So there's a real opportunity to develop those cities in a different way. We are seeing sustainable mobility trends scaling up, as summarized in this slide. In a few cities, they're going in the wrong direction. Talking to a colleague in Wisconsin recently, and he was saying that because of the local politics, they're actually trying to push back on some of these advances. But in general, around the world, there are a lot of sustainable mobility trends. Car-free zones, bus rapid transit, metro systems, car sharing, walking and cycling. So these are all increasing, but not at a rapid enough speed. And we're also getting increasing evidence that there's links between transport systems and human health. And this is just a slide from a paper done by my colleagues at the London School looking at commute mode and percentage body fat in the UK. And what they found was that the people who use cars only to commute had a higher percentage of body fat than those who are using cycling or walking. And there seems to be a kind of dose-response effect. So as you do a bit more walking, use a bit more public transport, you reduce your body fat. So there seems to be this relationship. So, of course, obesity is partly a diet-related condition, but physical activity also plays a role. And sustainable transport systems, low-carbon transport systems, may be able to help us move in the right direction. And work that we've done in the UK has also demonstrated the potential of active travel and reduced air pollution to reduce the burden on the NHS of non-communicable diseases like diabetes, dementia, stroke, heart disease, and some types of cancer. And we estimated perhaps around £17 billion costs averted to the NHS over 20 years or so if we could get the UK urban population walking and cycling like people do in Copenhagen. So, making that heroic leap of imagination to say that they would be walking and cycling like people do in Copenhagen. But it's not just transport, of course, it's also green spaces in cities, and there's increasing evidence about the potential benefits of green space exposure. Mental health is one key area. And this slide just summarizes some of the evidence about the exposure to green space in cities and its effect on displeasurable moods, reducing displeasurable moods to the left of the vertical line, increasing pleasurable moods. And so there's a growth in interest now trying to document and nail down how these exposure to green space is affecting mental health and whether it can be applied to cities at different levels of development and what the kind of dose-response effect is. Tree planting also, a lot of interest in tree planting in cities and its potential health and environmental benefits. So there's lots of theoretical benefits of tree planting. They shade buildings, reduce the urban heat island effect. They can also absorb some small particulate matter. But there's also some potential adverse effects. So if you choose the wrong trees, you plant them in the wrong way, you choose the wrong species, you can have adverse effects on the environment. And then some of the trees that, for example, produce volatile organic compounds, which are precursors of ozone, which is a toxic compound. Housing, big implications of energy efficient and more affordable and sustainable housing for public health. I don't have time to go into detail, but essentially what the slide shows you, the thermal imaging camera shows you the unmodified house on the left and the modified house on the right. What you can see is there's much less heat leaking out through the windows and the walls on the left, and that can translate into health benefits if they're properly designed. What we found is that we could avert quite a number of premature deaths in the UK and reduce CO2 emissions by retrofitting our obsolete housing stock with better insulation. But there was also a cautionary note. If you just seal up houses, you can actually make health worse because you can actually increase indoor air pollution. So you need to combine insulation with energy efficient ventilation and put filters. If you put filters on the ventilation, you actually reduce the air pollution levels to lower than outdoor exposure. So again, there can be unintended adverse consequences with poorly designed policies, but with good, well-designed policies, you can benefit health and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to move towards the vision of this city. This is a small city in Finland. I won't try to pronounce the name, but I was quite intrigued by the vision that they had. They see themselves as moving towards a city which sees waste as a resource, obviously 100% renewable energy over coming decades and sustainable transport. Healthy food is a very important part of their strategy with wider availability of healthy food, local growth of food, and so on. They see water as a valuable resource, so more recycling and reuse of water, and sustaining and developing local communities. So what they see themselves doing is moving towards a one planet ecological footprint living over coming decades. And what they mean by that is that if the whole world lived like the average North American, we'd need 5 planets roughly to absorb the pollutants, greenhouse gases and so on. The average European, perhaps 3 planets, something of that order. So what they're saying is they're aspiring to be a city which lives within their means. So it doesn't create a bigger environmental footprint that could be sustained if the whole planet were to live like them. So they're taking an ethical and principled stand to move towards this kind of economy over decades to come. The food and agricultural system is a key element of this because we know that agriculture and food contributes about 20 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions as well as, of course, to biodiversity. And Charles's group and our group are doing a lot of work on healthy, sustainable diets over coming decades. We think that in the UK, we could probably reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 30% without going necessarily towards a full vegetarian diet, but by optimizing the diet to increase fruit and vegetables, decrease ruminant meat consumption, increase poultry and other lower environmental impact foodstuffs. So it's more of a kind of rebalancing of diets. But we know behavior change is not easy, so there are still big challenges in moving people towards more sustainable diets. And we also need to look at emerging technologies as well. Redesigning the energy, water, food nexus, which in low-income countries is about addressing the challenges of household air pollution with clean energy, reducing deforestation, using water more sustainably with clean energy, and using water recycling systems, which are increasingly emerging in high and low-income countries. So redesigning that nexus has real potential. Using ecosystem strategies to regulate freshwater quantity and quality and provide flood protection, so mangroves, for example, and other natural ecosystem strategies to reduce the vulnerability of cities and other locations to flooding and extreme events. And moving towards an environmentally sustainable health system. In this country, the Sustainable Development Unit has made remarkable steps forward. It has reduced already our greenhouse gas emissions from our health system by about 11%, despite an increase in activity in the health service. And so there's a lot that can be done through health systems and health services to reduce energy use, promote healthy diets, and increase the resilience of the health system to climate and other extreme events. And we're now seeing hospitals and healthcare facilities being designed with much lower energy footprints and energy requirements than in the past. And finally, we need to look at disruptive change. And this slide just shows you one disruptive change. In 1900, on the Easter Parade on Fifth Avenue, New York, dominated by horses and carriages. 1913, there were no horses and carriages, dominated by the motor car. So that was a disruptive change. We might say, well, the motor cars caused big problems with human society, and we're increasingly recognizing that. It has. But at the same time, it does illustrate the rapidity with which change can occur. So will autonomous vehicles be a disruptive change? It would also promote environmental sustainability. This is just one vision from an Argentinian designer about new kind of transport technologies for the future that could be disruptive, but also health promoting. So we need to move towards one planet living, the healthy circular economy, which emphasizes remanufacturing, designing for durability, reuse and repair, moving towards a sharing economy where we don't need to possess as many goods, but what we're interested in is the services that are provided by the economy. So we don't necessarily need to possess our own car, but what we want is the transport services that can be provided by, it could be through cycling, it could be through autonomous vehicles or public transport or whatever. So let me leave you with the thought that although we do have some really, I think, pressing challenges which are coming over the horizon very rapidly, and we're experiencing some of them already, they will pose really major challenges to human health and well-being, particularly in the latter part of the century, but moving up to mid-century, I believe. But it's not that we don't have solutions. We do have solutions. Some of them we know already, but we need to implement them better. Others we need to develop, and this will require a combination of new technologies, decisive political leadership, which may not be just at the national level, but also at the sub-national level. We see a lot of mayors of cities, for example, taking very strong stands on sustainability and health. So we need to work with decision makers at all levels in the political system. And I think if we could do that, if we could capitalize on technology, on the NGOs and civil society, on the activity at the national and sub-national level, which is beginning to happen, and on overcoming some of the vested interests that we might come to in the discussion period as to how we might start to tackle that, and I'd welcome your ideas on that because I think it's a difficult issue. If we can bring all those different strands together, then I think what we can say is that it is possible to redefine prosperity, focusing on the enhancement of the quality of life and the delivery of improved health for all, together with the respect for the integrity of natural systems. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy, for that sobering and brilliant talk. Some questions, please. I must remind you that we are filming this, so remember your questions. One at the front there, and then the second one at the back.
Andy, that was terrific. We knew it would be. I'm Trish Greenhouse. I'm working in primary care. And what exercises me right now is the ref and pressure on academics more generally. And frankly, the sticks and carrots that are driving us are a little bit at odds with what you've been talking about. That, I'm a medic, so both universities and the NHS are actually generating some of this problem rather than solving it. And I'm particularly interested in the drivers for what we're now calling research impact. And the drivers we have at the moment, again, are not really aligned, whereas on the continent, they're talking about responsible research and innovation. Over here, that hasn't quite got... the penny hasn't really dropped. I mean, we're still expanding like there's no tomorrow. We're talking about biomedical innovations, biotech, this, that, and the other, to the exclusion of the agenda that you've been talking about. I just wondered if you can join those two issues up.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting and important question. I mean, I do think that, to be fair to the ref, there has been greater emphasis on impact, but not necessarily the kind of impacts that we would like to see. I also think that the silo mentality of many universities mitigates against some of this interdisciplinary work. And to be honest, the most exciting things I've been doing in recent years have been involved working with people completely outside my comfort zone, soil scientists and climate scientists and a whole range of different disciplines which I've never worked with before. But I see it as a tremendously attractive proposition. And I also see that young scientists are beginning to kind of vote with their feet. So at my own institutions, they've got together and they formed a kind of planetary health club, a planetary health network, to try and drive forward some of these ideas within our institution. So let's look to some of the early career researchers to challenge the powers that be to actually reform some of these systems. So I think that's great, and all power to them. I think it's marvellous. I do think also, inevitably money does drive activity. And that's why it's so important. I mean, what the Wellcome Trust is doing, the scientific community really needs to stand up and applaud what they're doing and ask them to do it more, and also to engage more research funders in this kind of work, which I think is beginning to happen. We are seeing some of the research councils here in the UK really beginning to think in this transdisciplinary way. The Global Challenges Research Fund, which, as you know, is rolling out at the moment, is supposed to be fostering some of this kind of research. So things are changing, not quickly enough, but they are changing.
Thank you. Question at the back there.
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed with this because things seem to have moved on. I, about a couple of years ago, did a lot of research into this, and you've picked up on really quite a lot of the things that I found which other people were not talking about at the time. So thank you very much. I do have some doubts about certain things. One is, are you quite sure that there's only going to be 2 billion more people on the planet? Given the number of people that are under 30 in various countries, I think it's unlikely. The other thing that's worried me, and I've heard it discussed in this room, is that kind of people think sustainable energy means nuclear power, which I think is terribly, terribly dangerous, and I really do oppose that as a method of carbon reduction. And it doesn't really even do that because you've got to transport it all around and, get the fuel from here to there, and what about the waste and all that sort of stuff. And the idea, my pitch when I was doing it was that we cannot have economic growth as we know it, i.e. just increases in GDP, which may be accidents or illnesses or whatever, and sustainable planet. We can't really do it. I was thinking while you were talking, perhaps you could talk, some sort of green capitalism that has been discussed, natural capitalism, moving companies away from producing kind of ridiculous gadgets and trash and things into something that's really is like organic food.
Okay, well, let me have a go at that. You've asked some pretty fundamental questions.
Meat eating.
Yeah, okay. Let me come to that then. Give me a moment.
For forgive me, I'm going to allow you one question, then we'll come back at the end.
Yeah. So you've asked a lot of very fundamental questions, and they're very difficult ones to answer. But population, first of all. Population 2 billion was just by mid-century, not by the end of the century, of course. The revised population projections are more probabilistic ones by the end of the century. We could well be talking about 11, sometimes 12, perhaps, depends on your assumptions. What we know, Africa, probably 4 billion by the end of the century. That's a massive population increase. And I think Africa's different to the rest of the world as I understand it, because with India, for example, it's largely momentum. So it's largely because of more young people and they're having relatively small families. But Africa, family size in many parts of Africa is still quite high. Having said that, we've got to recognize that in many low-income countries, the environmental impact of the individual person is actually much lower than in developed countries. So but of course they all aspire to live like the North. So it will have big implications for the future. So I do agree that population growth needs to be addressed, but it shouldn't be used as an argument by developed countries to say, well, it's all population growth, therefore we don't need to change our lifestyle, because that is absolutely not correct. We need to address the consumption patterns of the North. We can't go lecturing to other parts of the world about how they should control their population until we can show real leadership, I think, on reducing our environmental footprint. And I do think a type of economy in which the externalities, these damaging effects, are actually captured and quantified and then built into the economy is one approach which I would like to see used much more. Carbon taxes have been talked about a long time, but they haven't actually been implemented. And one of the big questions is why not? We can debate that later on. So yes, we need to move towards a circular, low environmental impact economy. We need to understand the right incentives and levers to move us in that direction.
A gentleman with a striped shirt and then a lady. Gentleman.
Oh, nuclear power, okay. I'm an agnostic, but yes, nuclear power is not the answer to the world's energy problems. It has to be renewables. I still think it can be a transitional technology in some countries where you can't move immediately to renewable energy, but for the long term, it's got to be renewables.
Thank you.
So Tom Oliver at the University of Reading. Thanks for your talk. You were very humble about the idea of the solutions that you're promoting. You've done a remarkable job in developing this planetary health agenda, which is really bringing together, people from health disciplines, but also environmental science, climate change, ecology. We're a bunch of environmental scientists from University of Reading, really keen to engage in this agenda. But a lot of the solutions that you mention rely on a top-down approach to institutional reform. So clean, focusing on environmental taxes, clean energy.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, the institutions that we have tend to reflect the mental models and beliefs of the people in society. And arguably, the root causes, could argue to be, belief systems about the idea of techno fixes, that we don't have to solve environmental problems, or the idea that the expectation of cheap food, or the idea that we should be accumulating private wealth. So a lot of these factors rely on social cultural mechanisms, and I wondered what you thought the role for the social sciences, behavioural economics, philosophy, to really integrate and make this truly transdisciplinary, and where you see the planetary health agenda going with regards to the integration of those disciplines.
Yeah, I see the social science has been absolutely core to this agenda, because unless we understand better what the foundation of people's behaviours and how to change behaviours, then we're not going to move forward. So apologies that I didn't make that absolutely clear. The social science I see all sciences as contributing to this. There isn't there is no single science that should monopolise or dominate this kind of agenda. But the social sciences are absolutely crucial. Obviously, economics and behavioural economics is very important. Political sciences, political economy, economics. I think psychology and understanding the roots of behaviour and how we can change it, whether it's at the micro level, some of the work you're doing is with the supermarkets, for example, in the private sector, or whether it's at the macro level. So, it's one of those parties to which everyone is welcome and everyone is needed. And we need a whole range of different insights. Some of the most powerful insights can come from, say, anthropologists, certainly understanding what's actually happening on the ground, not what people are saying, but what they're actually doing. So I'm a total convert, and I think they're absolutely a crucial part of the whole agenda. And what we need to find is a kind of forum where people of different disciplines can interact together in a fruitful way, and mechanisms to scale up the funding, which we've already talked about, really quite rapidly.
Thank you. Question at the back, and then Clara, one right at the front.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. My name is Lieve van Woensel. I'm the European Union Fellow at the European Study Centre in St. Anthony's. And back in Brussels, I'm at the European Parliament scientific advisor, giving advice based upon foresight. So the facts for me, which you explained, are a very nice overview, and also your options for policy are very strong. But what keeps me busy here, so I'm doing research on bias.
Sorry, could you put your mic a bit closer?
I'm doing research here on bias of evidence, and with all these policy options, it seems so difficult to bring policy options also into real policy. And once we have policy measures, the implementation is very difficult. Do you have any idea on behavioral aspects which keep us away from taking the actions which we know they should be taken?
Well, I'm not a behavioral scientist, but certainly I'm very aware from, having been a practicing clinician and doctor, I'm very aware sometimes how difficult it is to change people's behavior pattern. But first of all, one has to understand what their health beliefs are, what their beliefs are about, say, the health and the environment, and then try to engage on what they see as their priorities and to link their priorities with the kind of agenda that you might have, say, as a health professional. So applying that to this agenda, what I would say is that I think often the scientific community thinks that its job is to talk to policymakers and tell them what to do, and that never works. And what's important is to understand what the priorities are for that policymaker, what decisions they have to make in the near term, and how the kind of work that you're doing can influence those decisions. And often their priorities are very different to ours. So talking to many policymakers, they may have concerns about, getting re-elected or protecting jobs in their local economy. So you have to tailor the message according to what the priorities of the particular decision maker you're working with, their priorities. So this whole idea of co-design of research, co-involvement, co-development of ideas, I think is going to be really important. And the traditional scientific paradigm that we have, where we go out and kind of talk to people and tell them the wonderful things we discovered, it's great for us, I suppose, but it doesn't really work in terms of changing policy and practice. So this is where we need the social scientists to help us work with decision makers. I do think there are some decision makers that are really quite open to new ideas, and I have seen at the city level some good examples of really progressive thinking. I was at a conference last week or 2 weeks ago of city mayors from all around Europe, and they are really, a lot of them are really engaged in this kind of health and sustainability agenda. And what they want to know is, how we can implement some of these ideas. Show us case studies. I think actually we underestimate the power of case studies because, we tend to look down on them a bit. But, actually that's probably wrong, because showing how things actually operate at the practical level and what the barriers are, and when you come to change practice, what really happens, is so important. And often it's case studies which can help to sway people's views, I think.
Thank you. Question at the front.
No one has more respect for sociologists than I, but I can't imagine the social sciences really bringing about the enormous motivational changes that you're talking about and that we clearly need for our own survival to consider. And I wonder whether the sciences are beginning to consider the potential of the mass media, the informal media, and how those might be made to coordinate with each other over the heads of politicians if necessary. How people might stop people talking to each other. And again, it would need scientific imagination, innovation to kick that off the ground. And I wonder whether anything like that has begun.
Well, I'm probably not the right person to ask about that, but I think there is a lot of activity, again, particularly from many of my younger colleagues, very, very active on social media. They do seem to get quite a lot of a profile. And I think, I'm sure that's at least part of the agenda. But I am concerned about social media like Twitter, for example, which can really boils things down to such simplistic sort of statements, and also encourages very rapid responses, where often what's really required is a kind of more considered and careful response. So Twitter, for example, may have its role. It can help to raise the profile of things. It can also spread a lot of disinformation, as we've seen in recent months. So I think we need probably a campaign or more activity around immunizing people, if I can use that term, against the kind of pernicious effects of rapidly spreading disinformation. And I would like to see a lot more research, really. As a kind of epidemiologist, I like to think about in terms of transmission of ideas, like epidemics, and ideas can be like epidemics. I'd like to see more research bringing together epidemiologists and social scientists to understand the transmission of ideas and how we can maybe facilitate the transmission of more positive and more constructive ideas than many of those that are circulating at the moment.
And we have a new program at the Oxford Martin
Yes,
School just
you
looking
do.
to that.
Yeah.
A final question.
Oh, thank you. Well, first, thank you so much for the very, very interesting presentation. I am very keen on this theme. Since 2004, I've been trying to push health and environment together through my work. And my eureka moment was when I started working with fresh water, which goes from the forest to the cities and all that. And later, I went to work with the conservation of the Amazon rainforest. Yeah. And my question is related to forests. I'd like to know, how do you factor in, especially in the solution side, the keys of the forest? Because as you have probably read and heard, for instance, the studies show that with the Amazon, if deforestation crosses a certain tipping point or threshold, it's going to be a dieback and the forest is going to be gone and you can kiss them goodbye. If you think about, you have Amazon, and then you have Borneo in Asia, you have Congo in Africa, big forests. And what I've been hearing and reading a lot is that it needs urgent action. And if you don't put forest high on the agenda again, in the next 5 years, we can just kiss them goodbye. So I'd like to know what your...
Yeah, no, thank you. In fact, that was one slide I sort of had to take out because I had too many slides. But I've got, there's been quite a lot of emerging work on forest conservation and health. So there's quite a big movement now to bring together human health and forest conservation. So, for example, there's fairly emerging evidence, I would say, that forest conservation can improve health through reduced air pollution, through increased clean water, and in some locations, reduced vector-borne diseases. Depends a bit on the location. So there are people like Virgilio Viana, who you may know, who's probably even a colleague of yours, based in the Amazon, whose vision it is really to link human health and environmental sustainability in the Amazon much more directly. So what he's trying to do is to develop a network of community health agents who will also function as kind of environmental health agents, as I understand it. And he feels that if you can link the adverse effects of forest degradation to human health, that will have more traction with policymakers in the Amazon region, because even some of the elites that are probably causing some of the destruction of the forest, they are themselves and their families are being exposed to extremely high levels, for example, of fine particulate air pollution, which is damaging their own health. And his view is if we can increase the knowledge, the local knowledge, around how forests and health are interrelated and mutually supportive, then this might be another argument that we can use to try and help to reduce this, as I agree, is very worrying level of deforestation, which fell and now is increasing again, as you know.
So thank you very much. Just before thanking Andy again, 2 quick announcements. First of all, we have some wine outside in the Ile Cafe just to the right as you go out the door, and everyone is welcome to join us. And this is the last in the series of lectures which we call Health Fresh Perspectives. But as Andy mentioned, we have on the 2nd of May a talk within the Planetary Health series called Does Our Planet Have Boundaries? And that's going to be it's going to be a double act between Yovinda Marley, who's an environmentalist, and Kate Rayward, who is famous for donut economics. So please come along for that. I hope I'll see you in a second for a drink, but please join me in thanking Andy for a really fascinating talk.